I'm a unhappy, disengaged employee. I'm unhappy, I'm not engaged, I'm not really dialed into our mission. It's much more likely then that I'm not going to follow any of the process or procedure. Companies with poor culture are 3 times more likely to have a breach.
Today's guest is Dutch Schwartz, Vice President of Cloud Services at SciChannel, a leading cybersecurity provider. He previously served as a senior security advisor at Raytheon and AWS. Dutch has led security strategy and customer engagement for 50 global enterprises across industries like aviation, fintech, media, software, and gaming. Today, he partners with Fortune 100 CISOs to build cybersecurity strategies that deliver real business value.
What would you say is one cybersecurity mistake you see big companies, small companies make over and over again?
There's been really tragic examples of where somebody received AI simulated voice memo. People have transferred money, and not insignificant, like $25 million in one instance, where they transferred money because they believed it was their CEO. That one voice memo, even if it appears to be your CFO or CEO, that is not enough. There has to be a process of checks, right? If cybersecurity is only thought of as this group of 2 people, 20 people, 200 people over here, then the implication is there's a bias that happens unintentionally in people's brain where they go, oh, well, that's not my job. I don't have a piece of this. I promise you, you do. Because that's where most of the risk lies. It's an unintended risk because the criminals know this. They understand human behavior very well. You need to build a culture of security.
What should any CFOs at any size company know about cybersecurity?
Yeah, there's probably 2 things.
Welcome back to the Diary of a CFO podcast, the podcast where finance leaders share the lessons, wins, and challenges that shape their careers as well as their organizations. I'm your host, Wasia Kamon, and today I'm super delighted to have with me Dutch Schwartz. Welcome to the show, Dutch.
Wasia, thank you so much for having me. I know we're recording it today, so you might be listening to this at a later date, but it's Juneteenth. So I just wanted to note that and reflect on what a cool day this is to be here and sharing it with you. So thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Of course, the pleasure is mine. I really wanted to start with your story and how did you end up in the cybersecurity space in the first place, and any
Sure.
unexpected twist along the way?
Yeah, no, it's almost all twists. So I started my career as a military officer. So I was an infantry officer in the Army. It doesn't seem to have any kind of obvious connection to what I do today. So at one point in my career, I actually put up a poll right on LinkedIn and said, hey, how did you get into cybersecurity? It used to be called information security. And the favorite answer was pull up a chair. So it's actually very common. Yeah, it was like 46%. It's really common, probably more so. It's a little bit of a timeline discussion, right? So probably maybe today, if you're coming straight out of a certification program or a military program, a transition program, or of course, university, that's probably a little bit different today. But if you go back 25, 30, certainly more than 30 years ago, you didn't have these kind of programs, right? So really most people who are above a certain age, let's just pick 40, let's say arbitrarily, probably there wasn't a path. So they probably found their way somehow into what was then information security. In my case, it was very similar. So I had transitioned from the active duty into the reserves. And I had a friend, we were both interviewing, right, for new jobs, right? And she found a job in like 3 or 4 days. I'm like, oh my gosh, Ann Jeanette, that's amazing, right? But both their parents, she said, oh no, both of my parents are in the tech industry. And so they had set her up with a bunch of interviews with people they knew. And she said, I interviewed with this little company and I actually really think that based on your personality and like you would be a really good fit. And so I got in really accidentally. And that's the case with a lot of people. They find their way in from something. And maybe it's just they really love puzzles, problem solving. They love tech maybe. They were in some adjacent role. And then somebody's like, hey, we need somebody to figure out security for us. And they foolishly maybe raise their hand and said, oh, I'll do it. But a lot of people came through. So this is really interesting a reflection on how Chief Information Security Officer, sometimes it's pronounced CISO, sometimes it's CISO, but I'll just call it CISO for the rest of the episode. So a lot of CISOs, again, came up experientially, right? So like hands on keyboard, maybe they're doing audits or investigations. So there's, again, pros and cons like anything like that, right? So a lot of times they have a lot of great empathy and understanding for what their employees are doing, but they may have not had that structured path, right? That some other more mature roles, certainly the chief financial officer role, which has been around for, hundreds of years in a sense, right? So there's a nascency, right, to the CISO role, and that will play out as we have our conversation. I can kind of point out how that plays out, right? When you're working with the rest of the C-suite and the board, because there are some nuances there, as you'd expect, right? Being a newer role.
Yes. And so, what would you describe as what would be your definition of cybersecurity? And what do people do in cybersecurity? Like
Yeah,
grade level five
yeah,
explanation.
that's a great question because we even internally have these crazy debates on why did cyber security become the term, right? Because it used to be information security, sometimes data security. That's a little more understandable to the typical person. Cybersecurity, really, the intent there was to talk about as we move from analog to digital, right? So as we move from a physical file folder cabinet to an online version of that to a digital version of that, the essence of it we're trying to capture is how do we now talk about the value that it seems kind of ephemeral, right? Those zeros and ones that are digital. How do you think about that digital value? And then how do you protect it? Because it feels a little more obvious if I can walk over to my file cabinet and say,
Yeah.
and I'm locking it, right? Like we used to do many, many years ago. It's a little less clearer to certainly to a non-technical user of, well, what do I need to do when it's in the digital realm? And so that's really cybersecurity is really about how do I, first and foremost, in the 2020s and beyond, right? In this modern, what I would consider this current modern era, we have to talk about how do I align with the business, right? How do I deliver business outcomes, right? For many, many years, cybersecurity was a subset, unintentionally, probably kind of underneath information technology. It just sort of grew out of that, right? And unfortunately, there's some challenges with that. One of it, which is then it feels like it's very removed from the business, right? So maybe you're used to working with your tech support team, and then there's a whole nother team, and you don't even really interface with that team on a regular basis. And then they sort of didn't have a voice at the table because they were newer. It was sort of like going up. So for many, many years, it was very common for a CISO to report to the CIO. Now not that that structure is wrong. It's not wrong, but it's maybe on average, it's probably not the best structure, right? So that was one of the things that CISOs are like, hey, I probably should report to, again, it's going to depend on the size of your company, the chief risk officer, right? Perhaps chief legal counsel and GC. Perhaps there's a subcommittee, right? That there's 4 or 5 people that look at risk. Maybe it's directly to the CEO, right? Depending on if you're a technology company, Amazon would be a good example of that. Amazon and Amazon Web Services, both of the companies. In that case, it's so critical, right,
Yes.
to the safety and security of the customers that in that sense they report directly to the CEO. So again, I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I mean you can see this movement of we're sort of a cost center that's nested underneath of IT to oh gosh, this is becoming more intrinsic to our business, right? How do we make sure that we have a seat at that table, right? And make sure that and it's commensurate on CISOs as well, then to understand the business, right? And then to not just be a technologist, but to be a business executive. And that's a little bit of that shift that I've mentioned. And I'd say over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly COVID accelerated that, right? As we sort of did the world's largest social science experiment, we all went home. It became real apparent, oh gosh, we really are a digital company. Even if we manufacture something, even if we're in pharmaceuticals or, take your pick, people suddenly went, oh wow, a big part of what we do and how we deliver either internally or to our customers or clients or partners is digital. And so that actually kind of catapulted some CISOs to they went from the kids table, as we might say, where I grew up, to the adult table, right? And so that's that transition. And people are still finding their way. Like, how do I make sure I'm speaking the language, that's used in the boardroom and for my C-suite? And so when I'm sort of coaching and mentoring, that's a big piece of what I talk about.
I like the analogy of from the kids table to the adult table because I'm also curious when you said a way to deliver business outcomes. What are some of the business outcomes that people in cybersecurity, the CISOs, can actually bring?
It will vary, of course. So I start with like, first of all, if we're a public company or if we're a large private company, how do we think about risk? That's the easy, obvious one, right? So if you're a public company in the US, you look at Section 1A, right?
Yes.
And let's look at our risk. And of course, for your audience will know this very well, right? Let's say we might have risk of what if there is a natural event, right, that happens and we have a facility that's somewhere near a coast, okay? That kind of risk would be, and then you might have the risk of currency exchange rates changing. But there will also be some risks that will either implicitly or explicitly be related to this digital value. So I always would start with, if it's available, I would go to Section 1A. Okay, what is the board, the very learned folks, what are they thinking about in terms of risk, right? And then I can put a lens on it and say, okay, what's a more cybersecurity focused way of thinking about that. But I would go through each of the functions. So I would talk with my CRO, my CMO, if there's a chief product officer, and understand what are the 3 or 4 things that they're really trying to do in terms of outcomes. Let's just take, so customer experience is another one. So there's sort of 5 that I look at, and I just sort of start with those on the board, and we kind of usually pick a couple. Innovation, flexibility, speed to market, customer experience, scale. These are things that cybersecurity can help you with, and it's going to play out very differently if you're a knowledge-based company versus a manufacturing company. But there are absolutely things that you should be tying to. And when I'm stuck, when I try to ground myself, right, just based on experiences that I have, and I think about that in cybersecurity because that's a good sort of analogy of how you think about it, right? So if I talk to you about things like customer experience and resiliency, customer retention, then now we're having a business conversation, right? It's not
Yes.
about the tech. The tech is under the scenes. In the same way that I went to, like, a week-long course on Sarbanes-Oxley, and I never ever really want to talk about it again. Okay. 'Cause it's not my area, it's not my forte, but I've had great CFOs and finance officers who that is their forte, right? So in the same way that I don't necessarily want to get into the nitty-gritty of that, I don't need to, right? As long as you can explain to me why it's important and what my role in it is and how I help you. It's the same thing. It's really commensurate on the CISOs, right, and the senior people in security to not drag you into the, if you want to, cool, we can vibe out about the tech or whatever, but I need to keep it up here, right? If I can't explain it to you, like to your auntie, or to teenager, then I don't really understand it, right? I've got to
Yes.
be able to make it resonate with you. And I may have to try 2 or 3 different stories and find a way to help you understand. And it's the CISO's role to be a business executive first, who's got domain expertise, right, and digital and cybersecurity. And I have to be able to help you deliver a business outcome. If I can't do that, then you should keep me at the kids' table. I get it, right? I mean, it's still important, but you're like, yeah, this tech nerdy guy Dutch shows up and he talks stuff. I don't really know what he's talking about. Like, that's not helpful. I've got to be able to. So on the CISO side of the table, when I'm coaching people, I said, look, if you can't explain, and it varies, right, based on the company. If you can't explain to me how what you do impacts net margin, or you can't explain to me how this impacts your free cash flow or return on working capital, or you can go down the list, right? Then you need to go talk to your finance people and have them help you. You probably do know it, you just don't know how to articulate that today. And you need to be able to do that. I need to be, and same thing for chief human resource officer, CRO. Yeah, I got to have that connection, right? And then the same thing upwards if you have a board, of course, right? Those are often former CEOs, CFOs, COOs, right? They certainly understand risk, right?
Yes.
And that's the starting point. Like I said, risk is the starting point. And then how do I help enable things so that customers, clients, partners, whomever that ecosystem is, that they have a heck of a great experience, right? That's part of my role to help you with that.
Thank you. And speaking of risk, what would you say is one cybersecurity mistake you see big companies, small companies make over and over
Sure.
again?
So it's probably the fact that to do this well, it takes a village. And what I mean is everyone has to be involved. So here's my analogy. If you look at the history of quality in the US specifically, right, the history of quality, before you had systems of systems, it was really your craftsmanship, your artisanship, right? So you make shoes and I do paintings, right? And I'm an artist. You would just look at, well, how great, oh, look at how great those are. But it's really your individual craftsmanship or craftspersonship, right? But when you start to have manufacturing and systems of systems, you have to have quality. And the quality revolution was very slow in America, quite frankly. And initially what we did is we created a quality control department. Well, if there's a quality control department, I grew up working in a factory. If there's a quality control department, there's a bias that happens unintentionally in people's brain where they go, oh, well, that's not my job,
Wow.
right? That's Jesse's job. That's Sanjay's job. That's Tim's job. It's not me. And I understand it as somebody who studies history. I understand how that happens, but eventually I can tell you, working in corporate America, we all had to go back to school and learn about total quality management or whatever acronym it was, wherever you grew up and whatever. But now when you talk about you don't even have to actually call out quality. Everybody understands quality, how doing things in a quality process that's repeatable. Everybody does that. And so you can talk to somebody, and it doesn't matter if it's human resources or logistics or finance, it's baked in. It's the same sort of thing. If cybersecurity is only thought of as this group of 2 people, 20 people, 200 people over here, then the implication is, oh, well, that's not my job. I don't have a piece in this. I don't have a role in it. I promise you, you do, because that's where most of the risk lies. It's an unintended risk because, of course, the criminals, because in most cases, they're actually really criminals, right? The criminals know this. They understand human behavior very well. And so will they come after me directly? Maybe, but they're more likely to do social engineering and find somebody who's not aware, right? And they get their credentials and then they get inside your system. And now we have a conversation about resiliency, right? Like, how
Yes.
resilient are we if this happens to us, right? So you need to build a culture of security, not a security culture. When we use the phrase that way, then everybody goes, oh, well, yeah, but that's the culture of Dutch's team. That's true. But we need a culture of security, right? A culture of security does three things. Number one, it attracts talent, right? We have a lot of evidence that that's the case, right? If you have a great culture, right, and that includes being safe and secure, that attracts talent. The board level, it also retains talent, right? So that's really important. Number three, we know that companies with great culture, period, outperform their peer group. There's a tremendous amount of evidence of that, right? And you can look at any multiple metrics on that. And then the fourth thing is companies with poor culture are 3 times more likely to have a breach.
Wow.
Not poor security, poor culture. Because think about this. Let's just do a thought exercise. I'm a unhappy, disengaged employee for whatever reason. Maybe it's me, right? But for whatever reason, I'm unhappy. I'm not engaged. I'm not really dialed into our mission, whatever it is that we do. It's much more likely then that I'm not going to follow any of the process or procedure. I'm not
True.
going to log out of all the systems. I'm not going to make sure I change all these. I'm just not going to be engaged, right? I might just hurry. I might just rush through things. And I'd be like, yeah, I know the corporate standard is I'm supposed to use this software, but I'm just going to email this out, to the other person, even though I've been told not to do that. So when you have a poor culture, this comes from a book called Well Aware by George Finney. If you have poor culture, you're 3 times more likely to have a breach. So that's it's a way to bring that home. So it really starts with leadership, culture, and strategy, right? And again, those are not technical, but those three things are what helps you unlock the technology so that together we have the greatest chance of winning, whatever that means, whether that's serving our constituents or for charity or for public enterprise, it doesn't matter. But whatever it is that we would define as, hey, we're high-fiving, at the end of the year, that's what you have to focus on. So it starts with culture. And that's the biggest miss. It's unintended, of course, but that's the biggest miss. Small, large, doesn't matter. That's the biggest miss.
Wow, that's very insightful, and I totally makes sense that if I'm not engaged and I'm not going to follow protocol, and then be an open door to the criminals. Now, especially with AI now, and more companies are afraid of AI attacks because they look so slick. Like you can make a fake receipt, and it can go through software. Do you think currently companies should be more afraid of AI attacks that they currently are, or are they not? Or we think that maybe the risk is not as big.
The short answer is that AI influence attacks, certainly to your point, are very slick and dangerous. So what do we see? We see a couple things. One, what feels like to us a very human approach is very doable today, right? To your point, right? And so there's been really tragic examples of, and I don't want to call out any company, but where somebody received a AI simulated voice memo or an email or a video or what have you, right? And so those have already taken place, right? So you do need to be aware of those. So what can you do about that, right? That's the first question. My first answer is, well, so it starts with, what do I care about the most, right? You got to start that. It's an inside out conversation. What's the data? What's the process? What's the information? Do we have intellectual property? Is it client or customer facing? You start with that, right? Because that's the easiest way. Look, what are the things that if something were to go wrong with this, it would cause a really bad day. And sometimes it's not intuitive. So you really need to say, what do we really, really care about? And then you say to yourself, what needs to go right every time for that to work successfully? Okay, cool. How do we make sure to the highest degree we can that we make it easy to do the right thing and really, really hard to do the wrong thing, right? And you reinforce that behavior. So you should be concerned. I think there's a healthy, that's the long answer. The short answer is you should have a healthy amount of concern. The way that you would protect data and information doesn't change. This is just another way that this plays out, right? The same way that people have been robbing banks or playing three-card Monte and trying to misdirect you, those haven't changed because they're really all triggered on human behavior, right?
True. And you mentioned the voiceover, and I don't want to name any company, but can you provide other examples of deep fakes and synthetic data? First, what's the difference between deepfakes and synthetic data? But what are some of the examples that you've seen that happened at companies?
Yeah, so I'll take them in reverse order. So synthetic data is legitimately used by data scientists and people in AI research and other fields that are related. But synthetic data is if you and I are building, let's say we're building a customer facing a an application of some sort, right? Rather than use actual, sensitive client data or customer data or maybe patient data in healthcare, we would want to create synthetic data. And we would use that as we build our large language model, right? Or our AI model. There's more than one kind, by the way, but I'll just call it large language model as what everybody's sort of familiar with. As we're building that model, we go through epochs or iterations, right? So that's the way that you train models. And so we need a lot of data to do that, right, successfully. So synthetic data in of itself isn't bad, right? It has legitimate uses, but where it can be the really bad outcomes is if you can alter my synthetic data in a way that I'm not aware of or I don't realize, and then what it's going to do is it's going to create outputs when I'm doing that prompt. Let's say it's a chatbot that I wasn't anticipating, right? And so you really have to look at that. So a lot of that's around what we would call data provenance, right? Where did the data come from? And can I sort of think of like a crime show on TV, right? What's the chain of custody, right? So the provenance, where did this data come from? And can I prove that that's actually where that data came from? And can I prove that it has not been altered? Right. So that's a pretty much in the data scientists and security realm to look at that. So how does it play out kind of in a more typical example? It's very easy to have unintended bias then creep in. If I can change the data, if I can poison the model, you might hear data poisoning or model poisoning, then I can trigger an outcome that you don't want, right? So you have to do a look at that. So this really more around sort of technical controls, right? And you want to have a human in the loop, right? So you want to have a human make that last decision. So that's all about synthetic data. But what could the outcome be? I could skew a radiology model so that it gives the wrong information. I don't know what my intention would be there, but I could do that, right? More realistically, I could skew models so that I'm unfairly doing financing, right, for a customer set, right? So there's a lot of ways that synthetic data could be messed with. So you need to we're back to how do I secure my model, right? Or if I'm using someone else's model and then tuning it, I want to ask some really good questions around how did you guys build this model? And do I have visibility, right, into how you built that? And what are your guardrails, right, that you put around that so that we don't have explicit bias? That's kind of obvious, but also, again, implicit bias, right? We've all seen this play out, gender bias, racial bias. There's a lot of ways that it's maybe unintended, but it doesn't matter. It's still a bias, right? So if I feed you only resumes for a role that historically was mostly gender normative male, and I give you those, what a model is going to do is go, oh, well, then most of these names are the names that I see. And it's going to make an association.
Wow.
Maybe you didn't even intend to, right? Because that's what models do, right? Think about, let's say, the algorithm for one of your favorite streaming platforms, right? What it does there is it makes some inferences. It may not be obvious to you. So you just click it on. Like the other day, we were changing and my youngest daughter was like, no, don't do this on my profile. It's gonna screw up my algorithm, right? Which is hilarious. But I mean, at 14, 15, she's about to turn 15. She already knows this. She's like, no, don't watch that sports show on my algorithm, right? Well, because the algorithm makes some subtle inferences, and for whatever reason, it goes, I know that people who like this show and watch TV at this time of day, I'm going to present them these 5 other shows. And it can't even explain to you why it's presenting it. It just knows based on a lot of data that it's likely that you're going to like this other show. And so it makes inferences. And that's what happens with unintended bias is it makes an inference. It tries to say that there's a correlation or causality to these two things, a name as an example, that shouldn't exist. It shouldn't matter,
Yeah.
right? My name shouldn't even be on there, right? When it's looking at that resume. So that's how it can play out. And in terms of the deep fakes, yeah, the ones that are really obvious are people have transferred money and not insignificant, like $25 million in one instance where they transferred money. Yeah, they transferred money because they believed, fairly so, they believed it was their, I don't remember if it was the CEO or the CFO. I can't remember who they mimicked. And think about it from a voice standpoint or an email standpoint. It's fairly easy to do that. The criminals have the tools to be able to do that. If you remember back, what the difference is, remember back, like 5 years ago, you would get an email, it'd be really obvious. You're like, wow, okay, grammatically, it's just not quite right. And maybe there's a misspelling. And it was sort of obvious, right, that it wasn't really true. But now, one of the things that large language models do really well is language, right? So they're trained on natural language processing. NLP is what an AI person would call that. So they're very good at that. That's why it feels like we're talking to a human. We're not. It's not actually thinking, but it presents itself in a way. So now what a criminal can do is create a very smooth or slick, as you said before, email, and also change it really fast, right? You're doing it at automation speed. You're not doing it at human speed anymore, right? If you think about, if you prompt them, do you use AI like in your day to day? Well, yeah. Think about how fast you can prompt and reprompt and do. I mean, it's that fast, right? So you can create an agent, right, to do that prompting. And now I'm just walking over here watching watching my favorite show, because it's now the model is doing it, right? And so think about how quickly that is. That speed of that change is very fast. So on our side, we have to have automation to combat that.
Yeah, I'm still stuck on the voiceover. Like, how does it work? Like, how do you get caught into this?
There's a fun example of recently where a gentleman named Perry Carpenter, who's renowned in the cybersecurity industry, I believe he did it with a reporter. It'll be one of the news channels, let's just say, right? And all it took is a handful of clips of her, because of course she's a public figure, and he
Yeah.
has that. And he was able to create a very, very, very slick video of her talking that she had never said. Because the whole point of natural language processing is I can break words into smaller pieces, okay, into tokens, and I can reassemble those in a way that is so smooth that to the average person, even to yourself, it's eerie. If you do it to yourself, it's very, very hard. So what do you do? Well, let me bring this home kind of at a personal level, right? So you have to bring it home to people in a way that they can connect with, right? Tell them a story that they understand, right? And again, there's a piece of this of, I have a role explicitly, right, to secure things, but you also have a role in that. Like if we think about our neighborhood, right? Should I lock my door? But let's just say I have a security, I'm in a gated community, and then something happened. Well, the gated community has a role, right? Because I'm paying, right? Explicitly paying for a security
Yeah.
team. But what if I didn't lock my door? Okay, that's my part too, right? So there's security and securing behavior. Everybody has a role in that, right? And if we don't kind of coach it and teach it and emphasize it that way, then it's hard for people, because people are like, I can't. Like, that was the great moment. By the way, that's what I can convince everybody. I'm like, right, I know you can't remember that. Please, I'm begging you, use a password manager, and here's why. Right, that's a great example. Did we solve it all? We did, but it was a pain, right, to do all that and undo that, and it's all that lost time from, and the stress, and oh my gosh, am I getting, and generally today companies are very good ultimately about getting your money back to you. But in the meantime, and sometimes that might go unnoticed for a long time, right? People might, quote, steal your tax return, right, before you even file it. Again, they think in longer terms of time than we might in our day to day, right? They might steal your child's social security number here in the US when they're 13, and they'll just wait. They'll just wait, right? And they'll just sell that, right, with a whole bunch of other social security numbers. And then when that person's birthday is 18, they'll go open credit cards in their name.
Wow.
They'll play a very long game, right? Because it's organized crime, right? It's
Yes.
not, somebody on the corner hustling you, right?
Yeah, it's not
It's not
personal.
that movie that you saw, right? I mean, those are funny, and those do happen, by the way. I mean, that also happens. But I mean, if I look at the preponderance of breaches that I can identify, the majority, let's just call it 55 to 60%, are clearly the criminal activity, right? So this is a nation state, or I'll call it a criminal syndicate or a criminal actor. This is their job. They do this the same way that we do. And candidly, they collaborate very well. You're an expert in one kind of ransomware, and I'm an expert in something else. We have a trading network that goes on, and I'll trade your expertise for mine. So I can go hire ransomware as a service by the hour. That's a real thing. So think about that. I mean, that is how effective it is, right? So you have to think about it differently. It's not they weren't targeting my aunt specifically. They're targeting everybody.
Yes.
They're just trying to get information and then figure out what's the information that's most valuable and how do I do something. And that plays out the exact same way in the corporate world. Is there corporate espionage? Sure, there always has been, right? So there's some that are obvious, right? If you're in an environment, but there's the more subtle thing where they're just always trying to steal information and data. You have to presume that's what they're doing, right? So then you play that out. Well, how would that impact me? How would that impact our reputation, our brand? The
Yes.
operational stuff is usually really obvious. Like we're a manufacturing company and we can't do in the production line is stopped. Okay, that's pretty obvious, right? That's bad. So, but the more subtle things are the damage to your brand, the damage to your reputation. Do you recover? Probably if you have a really strong brand, but it's nevertheless in the meantime, there's an argument where like, well, yeah, but pick a public breach that we all know about. And then you look X number of months or quarters later and like, see their stock price came back. That's true. But what would it have been if it didn't take a what would it have been if it didn't take a 14% dip or 20%, which is often the case, right? Right after an announcement, right? And again, the subtlety of I lost trust with you. If I'm a customer or client, now we're back to churn, right? It's real hard to put your finger on that, but if your churn rate changes, then the correlation is likely that that event had some impact because there's some people who are like, I don't feel comfortable with the way, XYZ company handled my information, right?
Yes.
If people
And
vote with their feet, they're going to go somewhere else, right? And you may just attribute that to normal churn, but maybe not. Maybe it's not normal churn. Maybe it's, I'm actually concerned. I don't know if I trust your, I don't know if you have the level of trust that I want you to have with my information about my child's healthcare information, as an example.
And so when we look in the corporate world, people always go to accounting and finance. What would you say would be one thing you wish CFO knew more about cybersecurity or knew more or did better working with CISOs? Especially in small companies, there's usually not a CISO working there, but what should any CFOs at any size company know about cybersecurity?
And again, if there's not a CISO, whomever that most senior person is, right, who does technology and operations, depending on how it's set up in your company, where we could benefit from the experience and knowledge that CFOs in your community has is how do we quantify the risk, right?
Okay.
There's a lot of discussion in the CISO community, and there has been for a number of years. And I think that we would benefit from more discussions around what's an acceptable amount of risk, right? And so when I think about it, I think about risk appetite and risk tolerance. Okay. So if let's say we're a public company for a second, my expectation would be that the board sets the risk appetite. In other words, how much risk are we knowingly okay taking? Because we might go through periods where we're okay accepting more risk. Maybe we're going through a heavy period intentionally of M&A. And so we know that while we're doing that, or maybe we're opening up in a new geography, or you pick a risk, right? But there's valid reasons, business reasons, but I need some guidance, right? What is our appetite? And if it changes, please tell me. Help us quantify what's the acceptable amount. And then let's talk through, okay, and then how much then are we going to use cyber insurance for? And then how much are we going to essentially self-insure? Right? And we're going to accept that risk, right? Because CISOs want to know that, right? But in some cases, there hasn't been a lot of history of that
Yes.
conversation happening. But there's 5 things there. So as somebody who looks at risk from a digital standpoint, I want to understand, well, which of those can I impact? Help me, help
Yes.
you. Like I said in Jerry Maguire, right? Help me, help you, like help us, right? So bring me into the conversation and please bring us in soon. I can't tell you how many times a CISO or a technology or security person found out of an acquisition after it had happened.
Oh yeah, same thing with accounting. I feel like some position
See,
is
look,
the
we're
last
twinning,
people
right? Right?
with the last
No, I
people
understand.
to know.
Yeah, and we really do. And even if we like as soon as we can, I obviously understand there's a measured process we have to go through, but as soon as you can, please bring us. So I would just say bring us to the table, extend us some trust, initially, but we need to be at the table, right? So because and again, some of this is on our side as well, right? Because we were sort of viewed as technologists solely or first and foremost, we weren't in the business conversations. So when you're doing big moves, We're going to go in a new geography. We're building a new factory. We're coming up with a new pharmaceutical offering. We're coming up with a new service. Whatever that is, whomever it is that is the senior person for you, they should be in that conversation, because they might say, oh, well, wait a minute. Well, where are we hosting the data for that new software platform? Because those customers are in Europe. So this applies differently. And the rest of the team might not know that. How to help you move fast? I want you to move fast, but safe,
Yes.
right? How do I help you do that? And you got to, so bring us in and help us quantify risk, help us build the story around how we talk to them. Maybe you and I've got, okay, cool. Now, hey, how do we go talk to the CRO about this? How do we talk with the CMO and make sure? Because again, my job is to enable you to move quickly, to delight our customers, but to do it safely. How safely? That's a business choice, and that's okay, right? And that's the thing. You have to help me understand, like, hey, how much are we okay taking, in terms of risk? I had a great CFO at one point. I was a young business leader, and I was debating making an acquisition within my realm. And I was sort of angsty and like, I ran the numbers and da-da. And my CFO came down and said, listen, I need you to be able to take risk. And I'm like, wait, what? And he was like, no, I need you to be able to take risk. And I worked at this company. It was a very old company. So they've been doing this a long time, right? And he goes, no. We're going to talk, we've got metrics on loss and all these other things. And we talked about that for a while. He said, but I need you to fit, like emotionally understand. I need you to be able to take risk. If you don't take any risks, we won't grow. I
Yes.
just need you we need to have a conversation about it. And he's at the end of the day, after we run the models, and we did, trust me, red, orange. And after we ran the models, he said, at the end of the day, you're going to look at me and go, let's do this one. It's going to be a judgment call. We know what the model says, right? And that's okay. And he goes, and occasionally we'll be wrong, and it can't be wrong more than X% of the time each year. But I mean, that helped me a lot. He's like, no, we need to take risk. If we don't take risk, we don't grow. And so we need help with the language of that and how to quantify it and because in the world of cybersecurity, risk is just like, it's like the big giant capital letters. You're like, oh my God, like you're always crime fighting risk, you know? And so there's a visceral reaction to anybody who's in technology or cybersecurity around risk, right? And we need to understand that you have to take risk
Yes.
or you can't grow. I just need your help in saying how much is acceptable, what kinds of risk are acceptable, when do I need to pull you in? If I'm concerned about something, I'm getting a signal, I'm like, I'm not sure that we're going the right direction. Help me, right? Do that. Because then together we can help have that conversation with the CRO, the CMO, the product team, whomever that is. Does that resonate with you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes, and I feel the same, especially because I came from an accounting background where people will go make all kind of transactions. When they need payment, they'll say, oh, accounting, we need this. And we're like, where are you? Like, literally, where are
Right.
you?
Right. Yeah.
Last question. What do you like to do outside of work? Because I know you're very passionate
Oh,
about cybersecurity and it flows naturally as a veteran. So I'm always curious, what do you like to do outside of work?
so we have 6 kids. So we spend a ton of time in sporting events and music events. So that takes up big chunks of time. And then my wife and I personally, we really like to travel and we really love live music. Like, so we went to Coachella earlier this year,
Oh, nice.
and camped out. So, we probably, we're both big readers, and then just outdoor activities is kind of implied in the kids sports thing, but like, yeah, so go for a hike, go to the beach, read a book, that kind of thing. Love going to, museums, finding out, wherever you travel, just trying to get out and not go to the chain restaurant and not stay, I'm the not tour person. So I want to go out and strike out and be like, hey, and then you go find somebody, and then you ask the person at your cafe, like, hey, where should we go? We do that all the time. Right. I like to understand. So if I came to visit, right, and I've been to Atlanta, but I would be calling you, I'm going, hey, I'm coming in to Hotlanta, next week. What's
Yes,
happening? Is there a cultural thing
Atlanta.
going on? Is there music going on? Tell me the great rib place that I don't know about, that it's like not the touristy one. So that's what we love to do. So, food, music, travel, all that kind of
Okay.
stuff. And the kids. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now I'm curious to see, especially when you say I like going to the nut chains and in the outdoor, how you manage cybersecurity and all that, because it must be following you. Like I'm a CFO. So when we went to Disney, I was calculating in my head how much money they were making at the cotton candy stand. Like literally. It feels like work follows you even outside. So I'm curious,
That's
there is a
funny.
fun way that you do that too when you're off in some of your
Yeah.
fun activities.
Yeah, there's probably two things that are, tongue in cheek, but occupational hazards, right? And that's, yeah. So you're always thinking about, oh, this process is not secure. Like every time I come in, I'm like, how would I game this process? How would I get in and not actually be the person that's on this picture, right? To your Disney,
Ooh,
right? To your
okay.
Disney point, right? I mean,
Yes.
so you're always thinking about that, both sides, right? Usually you're thinking about is the fun side, like, hey, well, how would I break, how would I break this, right? But then how would I defend against it? That's one. And then because of my background in the military, then it's all, and then also like, where's my exit? Like, where would I go? How do I do this? What would I do in this scenario, right? And honestly, it's sort of unconscious, right? Because it's just sort of how you think
Operate.
about things,
Yeah.
yeah, all the time. But I would imagine it's the same thing. I know for certain when, in military movies, we watch and we're like, it would never happen that way. And when there's a good one, we'll all talk about it. We're like, oh, that opening scene in this movie was great. Or that scene, weirdly, like there's a scene in Forrest Gump. You're like, yeah, that's actually. So you're like, ooh, who is the analyst? That's what we call it. Right? Who is the analyst who informed the director? Because they were very good. Like it was spot on. I would imagine that for doctors, lawyers,
Yes, it's all the same. I'm
all that
just
stuff, when they
curious.
watch those shows, they're like, Psh, that's not how that happens. Like I love A Few Good Men, and I'm well aware that's not how that court scene would ever play out. Right. But I mean, I'm sure that but that I'm sure that attorneys are like, ridiculous. It never happens that way, but it's good theater, right? It's the same thing, right? I mean, there's some stuff that there's some movies that you're like, yeah, that's a pretty accurate scene right there, what they're doing in the movie. But again, some of it is just great, it's fictionalized and it's just great fun, right? So yeah, I think everywhere you're going, you're always thinking this process. And also like, I think about customer experience a lot. I go, man, this process is terrible. It drives me, so I do think about that a lot. Like you said, when you're going into places, and when you see a great one, you're like, you get the Disney experience, right? Where everybody comes to help you. They just stop what they're doing and go, oh, how can I? Then you go, see, that's
Yes.
good culture. That's good culture. Because you didn't, there's that story, right? That old story, right? Where, JFK is at the Space Center, right? And he's asking some using facilities, right? Like, hey, what do you do? And my recollection anyway is the gentleman's response was, well, I'm helping put a person on the moon.
Wow.
But that's the cult, right? So now you go, you guys got it. That's the culture. Because it is, everybody's contribution matters, right? No more, no less. Everybody's got things they contribute to makes it a better team, right? So it has to be a team. It can't
Yeah.
just be me with the superhero cape,
Yes.
fighting crime, right? It has to be all of us together because that's the only way we succeed, right? The automation, the AI, the sophistication of criminals is too great for any one team, right? So we all have to be like, can I make sure that I hate the password policy, but I know I get it. But I got to explain to you in a way that makes sense to you, right? And not just to you, but to each person in a way that they understand, okay, hey, this is important. Doing things safely is just how we do things here. Like that would be what I would leave you with. Doing things safely, that's just how we do stuff here. So when you're hiring and when you're onboarding, when you're training new leaders, you explicitly train them. And then over time, again, remember I said it's pervasive and it's enduring. So once you get that culture going that direction, all the what a organizational psychologists say, all the social cues will just align people. Because then they just be like, well, see, hey, that's not how we do that. Come on, we got to do it. We got to do that. Schwartz is going to say something if I don't do this in a good way. Like you're griping, but you know that there's a real reason that you're doing it. And you got to know there's a real reason that you're doing it. It's
Yes.
not because I said so. It's not because I said a policy that's annoying, right? Everybody, we all hate that, right? The mandatory training, boo.
Ooh.
What's mandatory training? That doesn't, right? Just the word itself is terrible, right?
Yes.
Mandatory training. Oh, yikes. Okay. No. Doing things safely is just how we do things here. Like that would be what I would leave you with.
Love it. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
being
you're welcome. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It
Of
was great to meet you.
course. Same here.